Welcome to Sometimes and Forever, the show where we pull back the curtains on the stories people think they know and give them a fresh look. I'm Denny Downing, and today we're diving into one of the most shocking, controversial, and psychologically rich novels of the Gothic era. That is The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis. This is a story of temptation, terror, institutional corruption, and the catastrophic collapse of a man who believed he was too holy to fall. Why are we talking about a book written over 200 years ago? What relevance can it possibly have for us today? As I was reading the novel, I began to think about recent events surrounding the Epstein files. Many people are calling for them to be released because they want to know who used to visit Epstein Island, and they want to know, what did they do there? It is no secret that Jeffrey Epstein was known by and befriended some of the most powerful movers and shakers of our time. So we look at these powerful people and we ask, how can people in such positions of power be so morally corrupt? That is the exact thing that is dealt with in this book, The Monk. So what is this story, The Monk, all about? At the center of the novel is Ambrosio, a monk. He was raised in a monastery since infancy. He is admired for his supposedly perfect virtue. He believes himself immune to temptation. He is, in fact, a model of holiness. But everything changes when he meets Rosario, a young novice who reveals a shocking secret. Rosario is actually Matilda, a woman who disguised herself as a monk to get close to Ambrosio. Matilda becomes a catalyst for Ambrosio's downfall. She seduces him not by force, but by exploiting the weaknesses he refuses to acknowledge. Once Ambrosio gives in, his fall is swift and catastrophic. What begins as lust transforms into obsession, violence, and ultimately murder. Ambrosio becomes infatuated with a young lady called Antonio. She's beautiful and innocent. He desires not her love, but her purity. His longing eventually leads him to sexually violate her, and he murders both Antonio and her mother to conceal his crime. While Ambrosio descends into corruption and vice, another storyline unfolds. This story, ladies and gentlemen, The Monk, has subplots, but don't worry, they are all connected. The subplot tells of the tragic imprisonment of Agnes. She's a young woman who is punished by the church for falling in love and becoming pregnant by the man she loves. Her suffering exposes the cruelty of the very institution meant to uphold compassion and forgiveness. Ambrosio, for his part, when the consequences of his actions begin to close in on him, he turns to the supernatural for escape, striking a desperate pact with the devil himself. But the devil offers only temporary rescue before revealing the truth. Ambrosio's damnation was sealed by his own choices. The novel ends not with redemption, but with punishment. Ambrosio dies horrifically and is damned for eternity. Believe it or not, Lewis wrote this powerful book when he was only 19 years old. The book made him very famous, and he became known as Monk Lewis. Lewis was actually born from a wealthy British family with political connections and social prestige. Lewis grew up at a time when the Gothic novel was still being shaped. The Monk, a novel that would define him for the rest of his life, was bold, scandalous, and everything British critics claimed literature should not be. Lewis wasn't afraid of taboo, though. Where other writers hinted at the supernatural, Lewis embraced it. Where they suggested sexuality, he wrote about it. And where they tiptoed around critique, Lewis kicked the door down, particularly when it came to the church, power, and hypocrisy. The book was called obscene, corrupting, and even blasphemous, which of course only increased its popularity, as you can imagine. To understand why the book caused such a stir at the time, we have to understand Europe in the 1790s. This was the decade of the French Revolution and people were questioning everything they once believed was stable. In Britain, many feared that the chaos of France might spill across the Channel. The revolution raised profound questions. Questions like, what is the true nature of power? Can institutions be trusted? What happens when old moral orders collapse? At the same time, anti-Catholic sentiment in Britain was intense. Catholicism was associated with superstition, secrecy, and corruption. Perfect material for a Gothic novelist eager to unsettle his readers, don't you think? So, what are the similarities in this book with the whole occurrence surrounding Jeffrey Epstein and this awful scandal? For us to see them, we have to look at the themes in the book. The first theme we can consider is religious piety and hypocrisy. Lewis's critique isn't aimed at faith itself, but at the structures that claim moral authority while hiding corruption. Ambrosio's reputation as a saint is based on ignorance, not virtue. In fact, in his quiet musings in chapter 2, we're told that pride told him loudly that he was superior to the rest of his fellow creatures. But we all know that pride goes before a fall and a haughty spirit before a stumble. Ambrosio thought himself superior to other people because he had been shielded from temptation. He was never tested as other men were. But as soon as he saw what is behind the veil of womanhood and what true pleasures can be his, he gives into temptation, and in a way, he becomes worse than the rest of mankind. This transformation of Ambrosio shows that the monastery is a place that represses natural desires, and these desires, once set free, yield dire consequences. The monastery is also a place where secrecy hides abuse and where power goes unquestioned. Ambrosio doesn't fall because Matilda tempts him. He falls because he already desired what she offered. She merely revealed the hypocrisy of his supposed holiness. The haunting question Lewis is forcing us to ask here is this: what happens when the people we trust with moral power are themselves morally corrupt? Isn't this what we see with Jeffrey Epstein and his cohorts? These are the people who have been given power in society, and yet they themselves are morally corrupt. In the same way that Ambrosio could hide behind the power of the church and the admiration of people, so too Epstein hid behind his powerful friends and the admiration they had for him. The church itself escapes accountability because the main perpetrator of the horrible crimes, Ambrosio, is dead. This is somewhat similar to this whole Epstein saga because Epstein, he's no more, and his main accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell, is behind bars. They are truly like Ambrosio and Matilda. But the bigger institution, the church, is like the other people in this whole Epstein saga who were knowledgeable about his activities but didn't stop him. So the second theme central to the novel is female power. Women in this novel are given specific roles used to comment on the power of women in society or lack thereof. There's Antonia, the innocent, Matilda, the seductress, and Agnes, the natural lover. So let's start with Matilda, the seductress, the intellectual, the transgressor. Matilda is the most complex woman in the novel. She's not simply the seductress or a Gothic femme fatale. She embodies multiple, often contradictory anxieties about female power. That's sexual, intellectual, spiritual, and political power. Okay, so why do I say this? Let's talk a little bit about Matilda. When we're introduced to Matilda, she's disguised as a male novice. This moment destabilizes rigid gender categories. She crosses gender boundaries, enters male religious spaces, and infiltrates an institution that excludes women entirely, because she went into the monastery, remember. Her presence exposed the fragility of male authority. Merely by existing within the monastery walls, she undermines the illusion that male-only spaces are morally superior. Matilda can be framed as a kind of Eve figure, leading Ambrosio into temptation. There is actually a scene in the novel when they were in the garden and a snake bit Ambrosio. So Eve-like. But here's the thing. To read Matilda as Eve oversimplifies her role. She's closer to a Lilith figure. You know, Lilith is the rebellious, autonomous woman of Jewish folklore. So she's more like Lilith. In Matilda, we see multiple anxieties. Female sexuality is one anxiety we see because she's comfortable with her desire. There's female intellect because she is far more knowledgeable than Ambrosio. There's female independence because she makes her own choices. In Matilda, we see the anxiety of society that a woman who knows too much has aligned herself with forbidden knowledge, that is to say, the supernatural, and this makes her evil. Matilda never repents. Toward the end of the novel, we do not see repentance in her. She never apologizes. She never seeks sympathy. This makes her terrifying to society. She's much like Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Epstein's lover, the one who did a lot of his dirty work for him, feeding him his desire for young girls. Matilda works for Ambrosio. She is the one who opens the way for him to be able to violate Antonio. She's smarter than Ambrosio in the same way that Ghislaine was more cultured than Epstein and taught him certain social graces and introduced him to the right people. Finally, Matilda infiltrated a male sanctified space, much like Ghislaine was intimately involved with and knowledgeable of Epstein's numerous exploits. Okay, what about Antonio? Who does she foreshadow? Antonio is often described as the innocent, but her innocence is not simply moral purity. Lewis uses Antonio to critique how patriarchal societies manufacture, idolize, and ultimately sacrifice female innocence. Antonio's purity is treated as currency. It has value, and this is a value that is projected onto her. She knows almost nothing about the world, not because she's virtuous, but because she has been kept ignorant. In Antonio, we see a parallel to the kind of girls that Jeffrey Epstein liked. Young, innocent, underexposed. Antonio pays the ultimate sacrifice for her innocence. And in this, she embodies all the young girls that lost their innocence too, and their right to girlhood through Jeffrey Epstein's actions. Finally, we come to Agnes. Agnes is the lover, the victim, and the survivor of abuse. Agnes's story is emotionally devastating, and I must admit, it caused me a lot of anxiety when I was reading the novel. Unlike Antonio, who is punished for her innocence, and Matilda, who uses her agency to challenge her authority, Agnes suffers because she chooses a natural, consensual love outside the rigid confines of religious vows. Agnes's only sin, her only sin, is loving a man honestly and wanting a family. But the church punishes her brutally. A woman who has desires is a threatening thing to society. Women should be controlled, or else they will give into every sort of vice. This is the thinking. Agnes represents the human cost of enforced chastity. She's imprisoned, shamed, starved, and left to die. However, Agnes emerges as the novel's symbol of resilience. She maintains moral clarity, remains faithful to her love, endures the institution's cruelty, and survives with her humanity intact. Her survival is a protest in itself. Agnes becomes a counter-argument to Ambrosio. He's a celebrated holy man, but he becomes a monster. She is a condemned woman, but she becomes a symbol of moral endurance. And in our modern comparison, Agnes is every woman who survived abuse at the hands of powerful people who would rather see them silenced and forgotten. She's the voice of those that dare to speak out and are still speaking for justice. Together, these three women, I believe, expose the central truth of this novel, The Monk. The greatest horrors are not the demons or ghosts, but the social structures that deny other people their personal agency and try to silence them. The novel becomes a meditation on how society uses powerful institutions to control others. Don't you think? If you have read this novel, please let me know. Just comment down below that you have read this novel. If you have not read this novel, please go ahead and read it. It is worth reading. And then you come back and let me know what you think about it. But this is how I have been interpreting the novel. I've been putting it into a more modern kind of spin and looking at it through different lens. Where in the time when it was written by Lewis, it was the church that was the really big authority. Today, there are powerful rich people. So money in our society has replaced religion. And so the people who are most powerful are the people who are the richest. And so these people hold the institutions of power, and that is why they are able to commit certain acts of abuse and seem to get away with it. It's the same thing that happened here with Ambrosio. Perhaps the most modern aspect of The Monk is its psychological insight. Ambrosio's downfall is not supernatural. It is human. His tragedy lies in his inability to see himself as just another person. He believes himself above temptation. He believes himself exceptional. His sin begins not with lust, but with pride. The devil in the novel is not merely an external force. He's the dark mirror of Ambrosio's repressed desires. Lewis seems to say, when you deny that you're only human, you create a monster. The Monk is more than just a Gothic shocker filled with demons, seduction, and murder. It is a fearless examination of power, repression, gender, and the fragility of virtue. In the chaos of revolutionary Europe, Lewis wrote a story that reflected the collapse of old certainties. And today, the novel continues to resonate because it exposes truths we still struggle with. Institutions fail. Power hides hypocrisy and corruption. And abuse can hide in plain sight. Matthew Gregory Lewis didn't just write a Gothic tale. He wrote a warning. One that reminds us that the line between sanctity and sin is far thinner and far more human than we like to believe.